Good. We're turning to another section of this subject. All right. We've been through the sequencing of how you set up the teaching process. We've done all of these things, and so you should know how they all fit together. Now we're entering a part of the subject, the final part, where we look at specific topics, and this is where the nature of what you have to teach, the actual content, dictates how all these other things work together. So you can't just say, oh, I'm going to do purely student-centered activities. It's all going to be group work. It's all going to be student peer assessment, all these wonderful, wonderful principles. And then you get to a particular kind of content that says, hey, you know what? I have to be taught in a different way. Or I have to be taught corresponding to this need and not that need and not that need. And I hope you'll see that in the coming weeks and in today's activity, okay? So I'm concerned with that in relation to all the rest, and you'll see that once again, the learning outcomes play the key role. And that's what I want to get across to you today, that you don't just jump in and teach something. You've got to know what the learning outcomes are and how that relates to this particular content. Now, it all starts from needs analysis. We know that. That was the first lesson, right? Needs analysis. In Australia, if you want to attract Australian students to a course in translation and interpreting, you need NAATI endorsement, just because it helps the students get the NAATI accreditation. I'm not too sure that helps with Chinese students, but anyway, it's still something that goes on the publicity. And to get the NAATI endorsement, we have to show that we teach the ethics. We have to show we teach ethical competency, that's what they call it, and intercultural competency, which is another thing. We do tons of intercultural, that's not a problem. We also have to teach ethics, and by ethics, they mean the NAATI Code of Ethics. So we've got this sort of obligation that comes in from outside. You may or may not like the actual code of ethics. Doesn't matter. You have to teach it. All right. But there's another need there, and that is that we train people to go out into the world, get jobs. About 30%, 1/3, work for any length of time as translators and interpreters. All the others, though, all of them are using languages in intercultural situations. It can be in business, it can be in teaching, it can be in giving advice, it can be in localization, it can be in IT. All of them, though, are putting themselves in situations where ethical problems arise. And so there's a certain second need, which is to prepare people for ethical problems in intercultural situations. And that may or may not correspond to the first one. And that's the problem I want to pursue here, that the ethics in need 1, this NAATI Code of Ethics, is often not the same kind of ethics as in need 2. And even in strict terms, the code of ethics here would be called deontology in philosophy, deontology, and that just means professional practice, whereas this kind of more general problem belongs to ethics proper, ethics as a mode of investigation and thought, okay? You'll see what that means in a minute. Now, here is the NAATI and or OSIT Code of Ethics. It's the same thing. It's developed by NAATI. It's adopted by the Australian, whatever it is, the Association of Translators and Interpreters, and it is adopted in New Zealand as well. People have done this. I hope you had one lesson on it. If you've done the Master of Translation and Interpreting, I hope. And you should know this. Don't be biased. Keep secrets. Know your limitations. Don't be biased again. But impartiality means don't favor one side rather than the other. It's very repetitive. You can see, be faithful to the text, only translate and interpret. Don't do other things like give advice or pretend to be a doctor or pretend to be a lawyer or pretend to be the friend of the person who's accused. Make sure you get paid properly and get the materials you need to work and the material conditions in order to do things properly. So that's called maintaining professional relationships. And that's weird, doesn't it? And keep learning. They're big on professional development. I just got an email this afternoon. I'm a member of OSIT, so I get all these courses. I can go and do a course in family law to help me be a better interpreter in courts. We can do a course on family law for interpreters. Okay, so there's that professional development. You have to do that. And very important, you're not allowed to complain about other translators and interpreters. Okay, so there's the 9 principles. I'm not here to teach those to you. I'm just here to show you what a code of ethics looks like. And our job is to teach that to people. Okay. Has anybody not had a lesson on this at all? You all have? What's interesting is that these 4 things concern translation and interpreting. The other things concern more or less any service profession at all. So if you look at it, really, it's not, we're teaching stuff that does help you in translation and interpreting, but it can be applied to a lot of other things as well. So it's that wider need that I was telling you about. Now, how you teach it depends on the learning outcome, and you've got to figure out what that learning outcome is. So learning outcome 1 could be that we're going to get people to memorize all those principles, all right? Like you do in primary school. There's only 9 of them, so we can write 9 words. CCC, that's really good. IAC, that's good. RDS. And I can put that like this, and I can say memorize CCC, IAC, RDS. Woof. And I reckon that in half an hour, all of you will be able to recite all those principles one after the other, like you do in English in primary school to learn the alphabet. You go A, B, C, D, E, F, G. Did you sing a song, Anthony, when you learned the alphabet?
Yeah, I think so.
Yeah,
it's
yeah.
quite a while ago now for me.
Alphabet Gamma Delta. You can sing it in Greek if you want as well.
There's not a Chinese one, unfortunately.
No,
there'd be 10,000 characters in the
very
alphabet.
long song. Very long song. Okay, so you can do these mnemonics, just tricks to help people memorize them. And that's what people do in primary school and sometimes in secondary school. And for an exam, you might have to learn it, and you learn it. That's one thing you can do, right? But the learning outcome is more likely to be this one, given the endorsement situation. We've got to make it so the student can pass the exam. And the ethics exam is given by NAATI, or if and when we have the endorsement, it's given by us, and you have to pass it. Has anybody here passed the NAATI ethics exam? Anybody? Is anybody going to sit it?
I passed it.
You passed it. Well done. Anybody else? Okay. Was it easy, Anthony?
Yes. It was quite easy.
All right.
It was they were not very divisive scenarios. They tended to test you on ones with a very clear point rather than more ambiguous ones. Was it recent? Because they've changed it a bit. I mean, there are 2 parts now. When I did it, it was only 1. I think 5 years ago. So actually, I think just 1 part for me as well. Yeah. And I confess to everybody, I failed it. You are unethical. No. I could do it again, and I had to pay extra money, but I used university money, and I passed it the second time.
And I asked them, I had to pay extra money to ask them why I failed. And they haven't answered me yet. So I'm still waiting.
Oh.
That's interesting, isn't it? So I think I was just being too academic and
so they have a particular format they seem to want in the answers.
Absolutely, and that's what I want to get to now. If you're training students to pass the NAATI exam, you've got to tell them only do what's in the exam. So in the exam, you've got these knowledge questions, right? And they're simple questions, like a friend asks you to translate their academic transcript and write that a grade of 75 is an A+, for example, right? Something like that. And you've got to say, oh, no, you can't do that because, and you've got to be able to go back to these things, impartiality, accuracy. I have to translate what's in the text and not what the person says, okay? The accuracy is accuracy to the text. And each of the questions corresponds to one ethical principle, and you just have to give that. And you can provide an example from practice, okay? So I don't know why I failed, but I reckon I complicated things by finding 2 or 3, as academics usually do. So this is very close to the memorizing. If you memorize them, you'll identify which one applies, and you bring it out and you give an example, and that's easy, okay? Then there are a second part, which is newer, scenario questions. You're given 5 and you choose 3. They're usually pretty close to real life situations, okay? And you've got to identify and explain the main ethical principle. So I reckon this is where I failed, because I gave 2 or 3. They just want the main one. Don't be clever, don't mess around. And you've got to say what the translator or interpreter should do there, all right? And it's very short, it can be just 100 words for the 3 scenarios. And if that's your learning outcome, then you know what? You train people to do that. And you just give lots of scenarios and you make sure that they can identify the principle that's there. And in fact, the tutorial activity today will be rather like this, this situation. We'll be working on scenarios. So you'll see what a scenario is, okay? So let's just consider that. Here we go from the principle to the situation, and that's always very easy. If you've got the principle, you can illustrate it. Anybody, no. That's much easier to do than the other one, the scenario questions, where you go from the situation to the principle, and that's a more advanced, more difficult activity. And these are the kinds of things that you would do in class as activities, okay? With one ethical problem per scenario, what the ethical solutions are, and then have to name the principles. So these are fairly simple activities, but to do them, you need a bank of scenarios or knowledge questions. Any questions on that? Okay, I don't think that's very problematic. I think that's straightforward teaching, as is done in secondary schools. It's a bit more difficult, though, if we want to train people to handle ethical problems that are not in the code of ethics, or where we have different principles coinciding or clashing. This is where we want them to go beyond. Now, in a university that likes to call itself a research university based on critical thinking, and that is what Australian universities like to see themselves as, we think we should go beyond what's there. We're not just there to train you how to do a job as you could do in a technical school. We want you to think about the job and think beyond it and around it. And this is where it gets complicated. And I want to suggest that for this third learning outcome, if you want to use it, there are several other kinds of activities you can use. And those other kinds are comparing different codes of ethics. I'll give you examples in a minute. Get scenarios where different principles clash or are not clear, or get scenarios where you have to say what you're going to do in terms of positive action rather than not do. All the principles that we saw in that code of ethics say what you can't do. And the reading I gave you for this week by Dean and Pollard has just come out this year. It's dealing with the question of how do we get people to think in positive terms of what they should do? What's the reason why I should do this? Okay. And that, again, moves beyond the code of ethics, which is purely negative. And then there are whole areas that are not addressed. So I want to look at those kinds of activities. Here's one, for example. I actually taught a course on ethics for some Italians last year. And I got the Nati Osit code and I compared it with the Italian one. And you can just line them up. And you get very interesting things, like, for example, accuracy in Australia is accuracy to the text, right? That's what it says. In Italy, it's fidelity to the client, which is interesting, okay? The Italians are looking at this in a very different way. And they've got lots of principles there that are about your relation with the client, which is missing in the Australian one. The others do line up more or less, but there's one here which is in Italy. You should only translate into your L1, your first language. That's one of their principles. In Australia, we don't have that. Why don't we have it? Because many people are translating into L2. Most of our Chinese translators, especially, are translating into L2. So just our economy, our linguistic situation says, that one there, you can have that in Italy, but not over here. And we recognize that we don't talk about your relations with the client very much, whereas the Italians do. Okay. All right, I won't go into possible reasons why, but you can imagine why that might be the case. This is more interesting for us, I think. The TAC, the Translator Association of China, has a code of ethics. It was being developed in 2020, and we can line that up with the Nati code, all right? And we find pretty good, pretty much the same. We can, faithfulness is there as well as accuracy, because Chinese ethics is traditionally based on virtues from a Confucian way of thinking about ethics. And what is really interesting is that the Chinese one has technology there. Whole lot of issues about using technology. Do you declare that to the client? Who owns the translation memories? Who owns the translations that are used in machine translation? The important thing here is that you should make it known to the client when you're using machine translation. That's their bottom line. But that in Australia, absolute silence, nothing said about it. And this one, clarity of role boundaries, is not an issue in China. And we'll see perhaps why in a minute.
Anthony, I'd be curious what the original Chinese wording is, but keeping secrets versus confidentiality to me suggests that the Chinese one suggests that confidentiality is important only in more serious situations, perhaps, whereas confidentiality sort of implies even in fairly innocuous or just everyday situations that you have to protect that information. I wonder maybe
we'd have to get back. The Chinese is available online. It's a very long document, but I've extracted principles from this. Yeah, sure. You can imagine confidentiality in Australia applies within the bounds of the law. Okay, so it's the same thing for priests or lawyers who have private conversations and are not supposed to reveal the content of the conversations, but the Australian law can oblige them to do so. The same thing happens in China. Okay.
Yeah. So, I mean, it's not just these things can line up, but sometimes they can still be functionally interpreted in quite different
functionally
ways.
interpreted in very different ways, as we'll see in a minute. The one on confidentiality is very important in Australia for journalists, particularly. We had a case of journalists in the ABC who had published complaints about Australian soldiers. They refused to reveal their sources, and the Australian Federal Police entered the ABC and took away their computers. So the principle of confidentiality is very, very highly challenged right, in Australia at the moment. Now, when I teach this, I do, some of you might have had this, I do compare it with the Chinese Code of Ethics for journalists, which makes interesting reading. Serve the people wholeheartedly, guidance of public opinion, truth, positive styles, don't be negative, improvement and innovation, comply with laws, everybody has to comply with laws, that's okay. Protect state secrets, there you go, don't reveal that. And present a positive image of China to the world, do a good job of telling China's story, etc. Now, that is a very content-rich, normative code of ethics. That, interestingly, is not at all like the Chinese Code of Ethics for translators and interpreters. That was my point in bringing this out, that translators and interpreters have no positive criteria such as the ones we have here. And these are very positive principles about what you should do, not about what you should not do, okay? And I wonder why. Why is that so different? And I just leave that in a question, as a question for people to think about. But it does come out, and I'll come to that in a minute. I'll just leave that hanging there in the air. Get some scenarios where principles clash. For example, this is one that's actually on the NAATI website. You're interpreting, it's between a doctor and a patient. You think, you're the interpreter, you think the doctor has forgotten to ask an important question because you know about this patient, you've been interpreting for them before, and the patient might die. So here you go, you the interpreter, should you ask that important question? I don't know, what do? You go back and look at the Code of Ethics. What does it say about this? You have to bear in mind that we have a Code of Ethics for interpreters and translators, but if you're working in a hospital, that's embedded in a wider Code of Ethics that's about healthcare. And the first principle of that is do no harm. So you're not going to do harm. But if your silence causes harm to the patient, then you have to obey that other Code of Ethics. And the way to do that said is, well, ask the doctor. So here it's the full situation is described there. The interpreter didn't become a doctor. The interpreter said, "Doctor, should we ask about taking the girl's temperature?" That was the question, okay? So she didn't say it, she just asked a question to remind the doctor about something he had perhaps forgotten about. You'll find a similar case if you go to that reading in Dean and Pollard, okay? So in this situation, it's complex because the literal reading of the NAATI Code of Ethics would suggest don't say anything. But if you embed it in a more complex Code of Ethics and a more humane one, you've got to help a person, stop them from dying, then obviously there are strategies. You don't not become a doctor. You're not just a passive interpreter. You're in between. You ask a question of the doctor to remind them. Okay, so there are ways of resolving these ethical problems. These are very interesting things to get into, and you can imagine in a class, you can use just one or two scenarios like this and get some very rich debates and discussions going on. This is another one that I use, and it's from a Chinese critique of Western codes of ethics, which is very useful. And so the author here is pointing out that Chinese culture is not like Western cultures. It's not, the Western culture has the translator and interpreter as an individual who makes individual decisions, whereas Chinese culture is far more collective and supportive. And so it's normal in China to have side conversations with other people, okay, in the courtroom or in the healthcare situation. And it's hard to convey embarrassing messages, as we will see, I think, in one of these scenarios today. So we've got these very different cultural parameters entering here. And Feng just says that the Western codes of ethics are for a Western mode of thinking, and they should not apply to Chinese interpreters or to Chinese people. Okay, so the question is, should Chinese interpreters have side conversations and tone down language in order not to hurt people's feelings? Interesting question. What does the code of ethics say about it? It says be accurate to the text, and it says no, role boundary. You are only the interpreter. Do not have a side conversation. But people do. And I don't know how you resolve that. The interesting thing is, I think, and I've written about this in COVID, the NATI Code of Ethics that we saw is written for the courtroom. So when it says don't have side conversations, don't give added explanations and things like that, just say what's in the text, that's good in court to give justice to all and make sure it's fair. But if you're in healthcare or you're conveying to people what COVID is and what the risks are and why they should get vaccinations and things like that, hell, you're going to do all these other things. Even if it's unethical, who cares about unethical? Your point is to get that message across and get people to protect themselves. So I think there are real discussions to be had where culture and ethics clash. And I'm hoping, in fact, I know that people within NATI see that they now have to revise their code of ethics to embrace a wider range of communicative activity. Any comments on that? No? Okay, I'm getting to the end. I haven't got a hell of a lot here. This is when I carry it one step further. So these are conversations that you have. You use scenarios to provoke reactions. This was not done by me. This was done by another teacher who got students to translate a text that was critical of China. Very dangerous activity. Critical of Chinese policy in the South China Sea. And the text accused China of bullying American allies. You can see what bullying is like over there, okay? Now, the student, this one student, didn't translate bullying as bullying. It was translated as resisting. My Chinese, I can't judge the power of that, but it's changing the sense of the text, okay? And what's interesting is that the student then wrote about that problem and said this, because I'm Chinese, I tended to use commendatory terms when translated words relate to China, okay? So because I'm Chinese, I will not translate things that are critical of China. That's very respectable as well. And then I'll translate what the text should have said, which is that American allies are willing to be controlled because of its great power in the region. Now, the student then compared that to the code of ethics, and we had a discussion. And the student recognized that the code of ethics in Australia said that they should have translated differently, that this would not be a legitimate translation. But the student's unhappy because as a Chinese person, they don't want to criticize China. That's obvious and that's fine. So how can you resolve that situation? I just open that as a question. What should the student do in this case? Or what should the translator do in this case? Do you have any opinions? No, too dangerous. All right. I'll give you.
Well, I'll throw myself
Have a go, yeah.
out there. I would say that the student misunderstands their role a little bit because I think actually the problem comes in the fact of what you said. They are saying they are criticizing China, but I think that's the thing they're misunderstanding. As a translator, it isn't their words in the first place.
That's okay. So what should they do? They should translate bullying, do you think?
Well, I mean, I wouldn't necessarily say that bully is 100% the only viable translation of this word as well. So there's a whole debate that could be had about whether that is the correct term and they're just avoiding it in the first place.
Yeah.
But if they're deliberately being commendatory where they feel that's not the real meaning, then I'd say they're just not being accurate and they're perhaps misleading the parties about what's happening.
Well, they're accurate to truth.
But I don't think that's their role, is it? I mean, the translator, it shouldn't be accurate to truth. It should be accurate to communication. Like, the idea of a psychological patient. You have to, if they say weird things, you have to interpret the weird things even if they're not true, right?
Yeah. The journalist code of ethics would say this is what you should do. Okay, remember that the code of ethics for Chinese journalists? That would absolutely condone this kind of translation because it's presenting a positive image of China. Yeah. And so if you're a journalist, fine. But the code of ethics for translators is different and different for a reason. And so my suggestion, I don't want to dwell on this for too long, but my first reaction would be, if you think this text is wrong and you don't want to translate it, don't accept the job.
Yeah, right.
Translators can always refuse to translate. Nobody should oblige you to do something that you think is ethically wrong. And so just walk away from it. Let somebody else have the burden, okay?
Emily in the chat has made a similar point to this, actually.
Oh, good. Thank you, Emily. So that is an elegant solution. The other one is Skopos theory. If people have done translation theory, figure out who the client is and what the purpose is. So if this is the Chinese Ministry of Foreign Affairs, who wants to know all the bad things that are being said about by China, because you need that information in order to act in the world, then you should give a literal translation. If it's a translation that's going to be published in the daily press in China or on a website in China, then you probably should not. Okay? So you figure out the purpose and figure out if your client's purpose is going to be achieved by one translation or the other. I'll just close this. I actually used this example in a talk at the International Translators Federation Congress in Brisbane a few years ago. And at the end of my talk, we had somebody from the Chinese embassy speak after me and give a whole explanation of China's role in the South China Sea and how it's a peace-loving nation, and corrected me because I brought up this example. My point in bringing up the example is, I think that sometimes we tend to think that good teaching is getting a good debate in Australia. If I have people arguing, as we're arguing or we're discussing, then that's very good and productive. Sometimes, though, you can go too far and you can create animosity. And I think we should got to be very careful in our teaching not to offend people, not to offend our students, and to recognize very, very deep cultural diversity. Okay, so I'm just summarizing here. I don't think neutrality is possible. Anyway, okay. Ethics can be taught as memorization. All right, that's the easy one. Just memorize these 9 principles. It's easy, folks. All right. You can go from the principles to examples, and that's a way of doing it. You can look for the principles in scenarios, and it's getting more and more complex as we go down, depending on what? Depending on the learning outcome. And then we can contrast different codes of ethics, and that gives rise to very interesting problems and questions. And then we look at scenarios that have clashing or missing ethical principles, and we look at discussion as the activity. And then some scenarios can touch on deep cultural differences and can lead to animosity, which means people are angry with each other. That is not good teaching. So I take a risk. I mean, in presenting that example, I've just taken a risk with you. And I thought that in a small group of advanced and intelligent students like yourselves, that risk was okay to take. And the point of the whole lecture is it depends on what your learning outcome is. Fix the learning outcome, and then the rest should follow from that.